Chapter 13 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Madge makes a discovery. Madge stepped into the cab, and Calton paused a moment to tell the cabman to drive to the railway station. Suddenly she stopped him. "Tell him to drive to Brian's lodgings in Powlett Street," she said, laying her hand on Calton's arm. "What for?" asked the lawyer in astonishment. "And also to go past the Melbourne Club, as I want to stop there." "What the deuce does she mean?" muttered Calton, as he gave the necessary orders and stepped into the cab. "And now," he asked, looking at his companion, who had let down her veil, while the cab rattled quickly down the street, "what do you intend to do?" She threw back her veil, and he was astonished to see the sudden change which had come over her. There were no tears now, and her eyes were hard and glittering, while her mouth was firmly closed. She looked like a woman who had determined to do a certain thing, and would carry out her intention at whatever cost. "I intend to save Brian in spite of himself," she said very distinctly. "But how?" "Ah, you think that being a woman I can do nothing," she said bitterly. "Well, you shall see." "I beg your pardon," retorted Calton, with a grim smile. "My opinion of your sex has always been an excellent one. Every lawyer's is. Stands to reason that it should be so, seeing that a woman is at the bottom of 9 cases out of 10. "The old cry." "Nevertheless a true one," answered Calton. "Ever since the time of Father Adam it has been acknowledged that women influence the world either for good or evil more than men. But this is not to the point," he went on rather impatiently. "What do you propose to do?" "Simply this," she answered. "In the first place, I may tell you that I do not understand Brian's statement that he keeps silence for my sake, as there are no secrets in my life that can justify his saying so. The facts of the case are simply these. Brian, on the night in question, left our house at St. Kilda at 11 o'clock. He told me that he would call at the club to see if there were any letters for him, and then go straight home." "But he might have said that merely as a blind." Madge shook her head. "No, I do not think so. I did not ask him where he was going. He told me quite spontaneously. I know Brian's character, and he would not tell a deliberate lie, especially when there is no necessity for it. I am quite certain that he intended to do as he said, and go straight home. When he got to the club he found a letter there, which caused him to alter his mind." "From whom was the letter?" "Can't you guess?" she said impatiently. "From the person, man or woman, who wanted to see him and reveal this secret about me, whatever it is. He got the letter at his club, and went down Collins Street to meet the writer. At the corner of the Scotch Church he found Mr. White, and on recognising him left in disgust, and walked down Russell Street to keep his appointment." "Then you don't think he came back?" "I am certain he did not, for, as Brian told you, there are plenty of young men who wear the same kind of coat and hat as he does. Who the second young man who got into the cab was I do not know, but I will swear that it was not Brian." "And you are going to look for that letter?" "Yes, in Brian's lodgings." "He might have burnt it." "He might have done 1,000 things, but he did not," she answered. "Brian is the most careless man in the world. He would put the letter in his pocket, or throw it into the waste paper basket, and never think of it again." "In this case he did, however." "Yes, he thought of the conversation he had had with the writer, but not of the letter itself. Depend upon it, we shall find it in his desk or in one of the pockets of the clothes he wore that night." "Then there's another thing," said Calton thoughtfully. "The letter might have been delivered to him between the Elizabeth Street railway station and the club." "We can soon find out about that," answered Madge, "for Mr. Rolleston was with him at the time." "So he was," answered Calton, "and here is Rolleston coming down the street. We'll ask him now." The cab was just passing the Burke and Wills monument, and Calton's quick eye had caught a glimpse of Rolleston walking down the left-hand side. What first attracted Calton's attention was the glittering appearance of Felix. His well-brushed top hat glittered, his varnished boots glittered, and his rings and scarf-pin glittered. In fact, so resplendent was his appearance that he looked like an animated diamond coming along in the blazing sunshine. The cab drove up to the curb, and Rolleston stopped short, as Calton sprang out directly in front of him. Madge lay back in the cab and pulled down her veil, not wishing to be recognised by Felix, as she knew that if he did it would soon be all over the town. "Hallo, old chap!" said Rolleston in considerable astonishment. "Where did you spring from?" "From the cab, of course," answered Calton with a laugh. "A kind of deus ex machina," replied Rolleston, attempting a bad pun. "Exactly," said Calton. "Look here, Rolleston, do you remember the night of White's murder? You met Fitzgerald at the railway station." "In the train," corrected Felix. Well, no matter. You came up with him to the club." "Yes, and left him there." "Did you notice if he received any messages while he was with you?" "Any message?" replied Felix. "No, he did not. We were talking together the whole time, and he spoke to no one but me." "Was he in good spirits?" "Excellent. Made me laugh awfully. But why all this thusness?" "Oh, nothing," answered Calton, getting back into the cab. "I wanted a little information from you. I'll explain next time I see you. Good-bye." "But I say—" began Felix, but the cab had already rattled away, so Mr. Rolleston turned angrily away. "I never saw anything like these lawyers," he said to himself. "Calton's a perfect whirlwind, by Jove!" Meanwhile Calton was talking to Madge. "You were quite right. There must have been a message for him at the club, for he got none from the time he left your place." "And what shall we do now?" asked Madge, who, having heard all the conversation, did not trouble to question the lawyer about it. "Find out at the club if any letter was waiting for him on that night," said Calton, as the cab stopped at the door of the Melbourne Club. "Here we are," and with a hasty word to Madge he ran up the steps. He went to the office of the club to find out if any letters had been waiting for Fitzgerald, and found there a waiter with whom he was pretty well acquainted. "Look here, Brown," said the lawyer, "do you remember on that Thursday night when the hansom cab murder took place if any letters were waiting here for Mr. Fitzgerald?" "Well, really, sir," hesitated Brown, "it's so long ago that I almost forget." Calton gave him a sovereign. "Oh, it's not that, Mr. Calton," said the waiter, pocketing the coin, nevertheless, "but I really do forget." "Try and remember," said Calton, shortly. Brown made a tremendous effort of memory, and at last gave a satisfactory answer. "No, sir, there were none." "Are you sure?" said Calton, feeling a thrill of disappointment. "Quite sure," replied the other, confidently. "I went to the letter rack several times that night, and I am sure there were none for Mr. Fitzgerald." "Ah, I thought as much," said Calton, heaving a sigh. "Stop!" said Brown, as though struck by a sudden idea. "Though there was no letter come by post, sir, there was one brought to him on that night." "Ah!" said Calton, turning sharply. "At what time?" "Just before 12 o'clock, sir." "Who brought it?" "A young woman, sir," said Brian, in a tone of disgust. "A bold thing, begging your pardon, sir, and no better than she should be. She bounced in at the door as bold as brass, and sings out, 'Is he in?' 'Get out,' I says, 'or I'll call the perlice.' 'Oh, no, you won't,' says she. 'You'll give him that,' and she shoves a letter into my hands. 'Who's him?' I asked. 'I dunno,' she answers. 'It's written there, and I can't read. Give it him at once.' And then she clears out before I could stop her." "And the letter was for Mr. Fitzgerald?" "Yes, sir, and a precious dirty letter it was, too." "You gave it to him, of course?" "I did, sir. He was playing cards, and he put it in his pocket, after having looked at the outside of it, and went on with his game." "Didn't he open it?" "Not then, sir, but he did later on, about 1:45 o'clock. I was in the room, and he opens it and reads it. Then he says to himself, 'What damned impertinence!' and puts it in his pocket." "Was he disturbed?" "Well, sir, he looked angry like, and put his coat and hat on, and walked out about 5 minutes to 1. "Ah, and he met White at 1, muttered Calton. "There's no doubt about it. The letter was an appointment, and he was going to keep it. What kind of letter was it?" he asked. "Very dirty, sir, in a square envelope, but the paper was good, and so was the writing." "That will do," said Calton. "I am much obliged to you," and he hurried down to where Madge awaited him in the cab. "You were right," he said to her, when the cab was once more in motion. "He got a letter on that night, and went to keep his appointment at the time he met White." "I knew it!" cried Madge with delight. "You see, we will find it in his lodgings." "I hope so," answered Calton, "but we must not be too sanguine. He may have destroyed it." "No, he has not," she replied. "I am convinced it is there." "Well," answered Calton, looking at her, "I don't contradict you, for your feminine instincts have done more to discover the truth than my reasonings, but that is often the case with women. They jump in the dark where a man would hesitate, and 9 cases out of 10 land safely." "Alas for the 10th!" said Miss Frettlby. "She has to be the one exception to prove the rule." She had in a great measure recovered her spirits, and seemed confident that she would save her lover. But Mr. Calton saw that her nerves were strung up to the highest pitch, and that it was only her strong will that kept her from breaking down altogether. "By Jove!" he muttered, in an admiring tone, as he watched her, "she's a plucky girl, and Fitzgerald is a lucky man to have the love of such a woman." They soon arrived at Brian's lodgings, and the door was opened by Mrs. Sampson, who looked very disconsolate indeed. The poor cricket had been blaming herself severely for the information she had given to the false insurance agent, and the floods of tears which she had wept had apparently an effect on her physical condition, for she crackled less loudly than usual, though her voice was as shrill as ever. "That sich a thing could have 'appened to him," she wailed in her thin, high voice, "and me that proud of not having any family of my own, except one as died and went up to heaven arter his father, which I hopes as they are both angels, and friendly, as his nature had not developed in this valley of the shadow to determine his feelin's towards his father when he died, being carried off by a chill, caused by the change from 'ot to cold, the weather being that contrary." They had arrived in Brian's sitting room by this time, and Madge sank into a chair, while Calton, anxious to begin the search, hinted to Mrs. Sampson that she could go. "I'm departin', sir," piped the cricket, with a sad shake of her head, as she opened the door, "knowing as I do, as he's innocent as an unborn babe, and to think of me having told that horrid person who had no regard for the truth of all about him, is now in a cold cell, not as what the weather ain't warm, and he won't want a fire as long as they allows him blankets." "What did you tell them?" asked Calton sharply. "Ah! you may well say that," lamented Mrs. Sampson, rolling her dingy handkerchief into a ball, and dabbing at her red-rimmed eyes, which presented quite a bacchanalian appearance, due, be it said in justice, to grief, not to liquor. "Having been beguiled by that serpent in light clothes, as wanted to know if he always came home before 12, which I said as he was in the habit of doing, though, to be sure, he did sometimes use his latch-key." "The night of the murder, for instance." "Oh, don't say that, sir," said Mrs. Sampson, with a terrified crackle. "Me being weak and ailin', though comin' of a strong family, as always lived to a good age, through being in the habit of wearing flannels, which my mother's father thought better nor a spilin' the inside with chemistry." "Clever man, that detective," murmured Calton to himself. "He got out of her by strategy what he never would have done by force. It's a strong piece of evidence against Fitzgerald, but it does not matter much if he can prove an alibi. You're likely to be called as a witness for the prosecution," he said aloud. "Me, sir!" squeaked Mrs. Sampson, trembling violently, and thereby producing a subdued rustle, as of wind in the trees. "As I've never been in the court, 'cept the time as father tooked me for a treat, to 'ear a murder, which there's no denyin' is as good as a play, he bein' 'ung, 'avin' 'it his wife over the 'ead with a poker when she weren't lookin', and a buryin' her corpse in a back garden, without even a stone to mark the place, let alone a line from the Psalms and a remuneration of her virtues." "Well, well," said Calton, rather impatiently, as he opened the door for her, "leave us for a short time, there's a good soul. Miss Frettlby and I want to rest, and we will ring for you when we are going." "Thank you, sir," said the lachrymose landlady, "and I 'opes they won't 'ang him, which is such a choky way of dyin', but in life we are in death," she went on, rather incoherently, "as is well known to 'em as diseases, and may be corpsed at any minute, and as—" Here Calton, unable to restrain his impatience any longer, shut the door, and they heard Mrs. Sampson's shrill voice and subdued cracklings die away in the distance. "Now then," he said, "now that we have got rid of that woman and her tongue, where are we to begin?" "The desk," replied Madge, going over to it. "It's the most likely place." "Don't think so," said Calton, shaking his head. "If, as you say, Fitzgerald is a careless man, he would not have troubled to put it there. However, perhaps we'd better look." The desk was very untidy. "Just like Brian," as Madge remarked, full of paid and unpaid bills, old letters, playbills, ball programmes, and withered flowers. "Reminiscences of former flirtations," said Calton, with a laugh, pointing to those. "I should not wonder," retorted Miss Frettlby, coolly. "Brian always was in love with some one or other, but you know what Lytton says, there are many counterfeits, but only one Eros, so I can afford to forget these things." The letter, however, was not to be found in the desk, nor was it in the sitting-room. They tried the bedroom, but with no better result. Madge was about to give up the search in despair, when suddenly Calton's eye fell on the waste-paper basket, which, by some unaccountable reason, they had overlooked. The basket was half full, in fact, more than half, and on looking at it, a sudden thought struck the lawyer. He rang the bell, and presently Mrs. Sampson made her opinion. "How long has that waste-paper basket been standing like that?" he asked, pointing to it. "It being the only fault I had to find with him," said Mrs. Sampson, "he being that untidy that he never let me clean it out till he told me personally. He said as how he throwed things into it as he might have to look up again, and I haven't touched it for more nor 6 weeks. 'Oping you won't think me a bad housekeeper, it being his own wish, being fond of litter and such like." "6 weeks," repeated Calton, with a look at Madge. "Ah! and he got the letter 4 weeks ago. Depend upon it, we shall find it there." Madge gave a cry, and, falling on her knees, emptied the basket out on the floor, and both she and Calton were soon as busy among the fragments of paper as though they were rag-pickers. "'Oping they aren't off their heads," murmured Mrs. Sampson, as she went to the door, "but it looks like it, they bein'—" Suddenly a cry broke from Madge, as she drew out of the mass of paper a half-burnt letter, written on thick and creamy-looking paper. "At last!" she cried, rising off her knees and smoothing it out. "I knew he had not destroyed it." "Pretty nearly, however," said Calton, as his eyes glanced rapidly over it. "It's almost useless as it is. There's no name to it." He took it over to the window, and spread it out upon the table. It was dirty and half burnt, but still it was a clue. There was not much left of it. "There is not much to be gained from that, I'm afraid," said Madge, sadly. "It shows that he had an appointment, but where?" Calton did not answer, but, leaning his head on his hands, stared hard at the paper. At last he jumped up with a cry. "I have it!" he said, in an excited tone. "Look at that paper. See how creamy and white it is, and, above all, look at the printing on the corner. Ott Villa, Toorak." "Then he went down to Toorak? In an hour, and back again? Hardly." "Then it was not written from Toorak?" "No, it was written in one of the Melbourne back slums." "How do you know?" "Look at the girl who brought it," said Calton, quickly. "A disreputable-looking woman, one far more likely to come from the back slums than from Toorak. As to the paper, 3 months ago there was a robbery at Toorak, and this is some of the paper that was stolen by the thieves." Madge said nothing, but her sparkling eyes and the nervous trembling of her hands showed her excitement. "I will see a detective this evening," said Calton, exultingly. "Find out where this letter came from, and who wrote it. We'll save him yet," he said, placing the precious letter carefully in his pocket book. "You think you will be able to find the woman who wrote that?" "H'm," said the lawyer, looking thoughtful. "She may be dead, as the letter says she is in a dying condition. However, if I can find the woman who delivered the letter at the club, and waited for Fitzgerald at the corner of Bourke and Russell Street, that will be sufficient. All I want to prove is that he was not in the hansom cab with White." "And do you think you can do that?" "Depends upon this letter," said Calton, tapping his pocket book with his finger. "I'll tell you to morrow." Shortly afterwards they left the house, and when Calton put Madge safely into the St. Kilda train, her heart felt lighter than it had done since Fitzgerald's arrest. Chapter 13. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.